now we continue our theme on innovation, but we shift a little bit to public policy. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Richard-Duane Chambers. And while he's making his way down here, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's the Director of Policy and Integration at the CHIPS Research and Development Office of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST. His office is supporting the development of semiconductor technologies to enhance the competitiveness of the U.S. semiconductor industry. Prior to this, he served as professional staff in the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, where he contributed to the analysis, language, and negotiation of the CHIPS and Science Act, which is what he's going to speak about right now. And prior to that, he actually served at DARPA, worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, and was fellow at the National Science Foundation. He earned 2 degrees at MIT, one as a bachelor's in aeronautics and astronautics. For any MIT undergrads in the audience, that's course 16. You might recognize it that way. And also a master's in technology, and public policy. I asked him to tell me a little bit about something memorable from his time here at MIT, and he mentioned that one of the most memorable, interesting times was actually his experience with the MIT Taekwondo Club. And so for any aspiring future technology and policy leaders, you have to go through the Taekwondo Club, and they're ready to take your application. So with that, please welcome Richard-Duane to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Awesome. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I go any further, let me start off with a disclaimer. Statements and responses to questions about advanced microelectronics research and development programs in this presentation are informational, pre-decisional, and preliminary in nature, do not constitute a commitment, and are not binding on NIST or the Department of Commerce, and any subject matter in their entirety are subject in their entirety to any final action by NIST or the Department of Commerce. Further, nothing in this presentation is intended to contradict or supersede the requirements published in any future documents or notices of funding opportunity. Now that I've established myself as an entirely unreliable narrator, let me say it is great to be back at MIT. In all seriousness, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in today's symposium. And moreover, I'd like to thank MIT for its long commitment to advancing American innovation and competitiveness. For my years on the Senate Commerce Committee, I know MIT is among the universities that steps up when the nation needs someone to speak for the academic community, to defend our long history of innovation, and to ensure that America remains globally competitive. So here's an example. The date is April 14th, 2021. The Senate is having its very first hearing on what would become the CHIPS and Science Act, a $250 billion commitment to investing in American technology and leadership. And the speakers are a former senior government official, a venture capital leader, a CEO, representatives from the University of Notre Dame and of Mississippi State University, and one Bill Bonvillian, senior director of the MIT Office of Open Learning. And this is what Bill said in advocating for action. US technology history is littered with technologies innovated here in the United States that did not scale up here and were produced there. Unfortunately, the semiconductor industry is among those with that story. Here are some facts. 1947, the transistor is invented at Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. By the 1960s, the semiconductor industry had entered a golden age, in part due to formative investments from the federal government. So in 1963, the Apollo program bought 60% of the US chip supply. And the government was a demanding customer, and it meant that this really young technology had to become reliable in extreme environments for our nation's most important missions. In the days before venture capital, federal funding, not only into these companies, but also into universities like Stanford for research and education, helped to turn Silicon Valley from an agricultural center into a manufacturing center for microprocessors, and creating what we now refer to as a regional tech hub. And as the industry had to morph to meet the demands of things like the mobile revolution, the internet boom, and continue to chase smaller and smaller transistors through Moore's law during the period before that, this was a Herculean task. And it was led by industry, but with supportive agencies like DARPA and my home agency, NIST. With this mix of great companies, great universities, and some federal support, by 1990, the United States produced 37% of all the world's chips. But what a difference a few decades can make. When Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022, US semiconductor production had fallen to 12% globally. Further down the value chain, the United States packaged only 3% of chips, with Asia accounting for the vast majority of the rest. While other nations had chased innovation in manufacturing, heard about that a little bit today, lower costs, greater efficiency, combined with subsidies to attract manufacturers to their shores, the United States continued to do what we in general do best, chasing new revolutionary inventions, and there's nothing wrong with that. And for a long time, it seemed like it was good enough, until those other nations started transforming their manufacturing prowess and investment into technology leadership. So by 2021, the United States continued to lead the world in semiconductor design, but none of the world's most advanced chips were produced here at volume. Taiwan alone produced 92% of them. In the past 20 years from that period, the US would lose more than a third of its semiconductor manufacturing workforce, even as the global industry tripled. And taken together, these facts created a national and economic security imperative to act. With so much of our high-tech economy, from iPhones to AI, dependent on leading-edge chips, it is insufficient for the United States to be so dependent on other nations, even our friends and allies. With our automotive industry, with our pharmaceutical industry so dependent on more mature chips, it's insufficient for the United States to be dependent on other nations, including our friends and allies. In 2021, car prices increased nearly 30% and were responsible for a third of core inflation, part because we didn't have enough chips. So strengthening the entire supply chain is necessary to securing our economic and national security. And I'll give an example. The war in Ukraine brought it into really clear view. One of the first things the United States did was to deny Russia to the microelectronics it needed to power its war machine. And then soon enough, we started seeing stories that Russia, a major European power, was pulling chips out of washing machines to put into military drones. It's not a place the United States can afford to be. So Congress and the administration set out an altogether different vision. When the CHIPS and Science Act passed, Congress provided more than $50 billion to the cause. $39 billion to the Department of Commerce and manufacturing incentives for companies willing to build those facilities in the United States. $11 billion for the department for research awards across 4 programs, which I'll talk about. $2 billion to DoD, the Department of Defense, for a series of geographically diverse research hubs. $500 million to the Department of State to promote secure telecommunications networks and semiconductor supply chain security. $200 million to the NSF, National Science Foundation. I'm sure everyone don't actually have to explain NSF in this room, to promote semiconductor-related workforce development. And an agreement to the Department of Treasury to manage an investment tax credit. And this is easy to think of as a series of numbers, but to catalyze a response from American manufacturers, I think it was really critical that we turn those numbers into an impact that we could imagine. So in 2023, the Commerce Secretary announced her intention for the United States to have at least 2 new large-scale clusters of leading-edge logic fabs, in addition to new capabilities for US-based memory manufacturing and packaging. 2024, she went further and said that by the end of 2030, the United States would produce 20% of leading-edge chips. I think this approach is working. Before a single dollar of the chips manufacturing incentives went out the door, private sector companies announced more than $200 billion in investments, showing that public dollars can catalyze private investment. Just last week, the Department of Commerce announced its 7th non-binding preliminary memorandum of terms to provide Micron Technology direct funding to boost leading-edge memory production. We've announced agreements with Samsung for expansion in Texas, TSMC, Arizona, Intel for facilities in Arizona, New Mexico, Ohio, and Oregon. And as an example, by investing in Intel's US operations, the administration's seeking to reduce the geographic concentration of leading-edge foundries in Asia, create over 30,000 good jobs, and better enable US companies to lead in the AI industry by ensuring we have a domestic supply to those advanced chips. But we recognize that investing in manufacturing alone is not enough to secure America's future leadership. We must continue to invest in what we know we do best, inventing the future. The CHIPS and Science Act and the work that we are doing in the Department of Commerce will not only boost domestic manufacturing and make supply chains more resilient, huge win, we also hope it unleashes a new generation of technology innovation. That's why the Secretary has also called on the United States to be a nation that invents new chip architectures and designs chips for every application. The CHIPS Research and Development Office is trying to make that goal a reality through 4 programs created by Congress. In January, we announced that we would spend at least $200 million in a new Manufacturing USA Institute to enable the integration of digital twin models into US semiconductor manufacturing. That notice of funding opportunity will be made available in the near future. In February, the National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program released its first notice of funding opportunity, up to $300 million to accelerate the domestic capacity for advanced packaging substrates. And while applications to that funding opportunity recently closed, the program has outlined additional funding areas like equipment, thermal management, photonics, and design. In April, the NIST Metrology Program released its first funding opportunity, up to $54 million for small businesses to explore innovative ideas or technologies and to develop them into valuable products. Small businesses are invited to apply through June 14th. And just a few weeks ago, Natcast, the operator of the $5 billion plus National Semiconductor Technology Center, the centerpiece of the CHIPS R&D program, announced its first research areas, one in the application of artificial intelligence to the design of radio frequency chips, and another for the development of test vehicles for semiconductor R&D. These calls for proposals are expected to become available this summer, and I should say, the goals of Natcast are to build US leadership in the NSDC, build US leadership in foundational semiconductor technologies, to reduce the time and cost to prototype, and to grow the workforce. All issues we've talked about today. So we're making progress, but there's always a but. The title of this talk is The Federal Role in Semiconductor Leadership. And we've heard how federal funding can catalyze private action, enhance manufacturing, be a demand signal, help create technology hubs. But the problem is federal funding is not enough on its own because no government can create a fully functional innovation and manufacturing ecosystem. We can only create the conditions needed. So let us talk about the conditions. I'll go back to Bill. Innovation needs a series of strong actors. There needs to be a two-way street, exchanges so that the tech development influences the R&D and not just the R&D influencing the tech development. I'll add this observation. I think you need a culture of innovation where researchers seek not only to develop the very best ideas, but also to see them apply to today's manufacturing problems, including problems like the economics of manufacturing right here in the United States. So let's talk about what some of the things the federal government, academia, and businesses can do to knit those pieces of success together. First, I believe we've got to accelerate commercialization. Make that the center of our research work. The simple fact is that it is hard to move from an idea to a product, and particularly difficult to do so in the semiconductor industry. By some analyses, it takes up to 18 months to go from a design to a testable chip, 500 million to 1.5 billion to design a chip. And at the same time, venture capital for hardware companies is not easy to find. So the federal government can't just plan to fund the development of a new idea, but we've got to figure out how to do the hard work to accelerate that idea to domestic production, to commercial availability. And in fact, the Secretary has called for the nation to cut in half the projected cost of moving a new chip from concept to commercialization. And to be clear, I know where I am, that's not to say we don't want new or groundbreaking ideas or that basic research isn't incredibly important. It is to say that we must build an ecosystem that allows those ideas to be developed and prototyped and commercialized here in the United States. So researchers should expect that CHIPS R&D will keep as one of its core missions, as expressed in the NSTC vision paper, to provide domestic access to advanced prototyping capabilities. Universities, companies, startups that want access not only to research dollars, but also to those facilities should plan to join the NSTC. And I'll point out that the NSTC has already launched a community of interest, a zero-cost pre-membership program. You can go sign up for that today at natcast.org. Moreover, researchers should expect that generally CHIPS R&D funding opportunities will prioritize proposals that demonstrate a viable path to commercializing innovations and for domestic production. In March, we released a guidebook on these principles. So when making proposals, we want researchers to ask questions like, what value will my innovation provide? What capabilities are required to achieve full-rate production? Can the production or sale of this innovation support a regional semiconductor ecosystem in the United States? We're actively working to foster the linkages between idea, product, and manufacturability. Second, we must strongly commit to not only creating new ideas, but also to protecting our intellectual property. Even as the United States continues its historical strength in innovation, competitor nations have aggressively sought to acquire US IP through licit and illicit means, including from universities like this one and from industry research organizations. I saw a number, the FBI estimates that the annual cost to the US economy of counterfeit goods, pirated software, and the theft of trade secrets, annual, $600 billion. In this environment, we must all work together to protect federally funded research, non-federally funded research, and the economic and national security advantages they provide. So that's why CHIPS R&D is dedicated to advancing technology protection. In February, we put out a chip technology protection guidebook based on a larger NIST document called IR 8484 to help universities and researchers address research security. And I want to be clear. We invite international students, international faculty, international companies to participate in our research. We talked about some of those companies that are getting funding right now: Samsung, TSMC. But we will also ask our researchers, regardless of their national origin, to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. We're also asking each of the participants to be our partners in protecting the technology, to recognize the importance of a US open innovation framework, but to assess what technology should be kept from foreign adversaries, to assess which technologies, maybe I don't publish this one. Maybe I keep it somewhere and we figure out in our closed ecosystem how to make it work. We're asking you to know who your partners are. And moreover, CHIPS R&D has a unique statutory requirement to ensure that federally funded IP remains subject to domestic control. For entities that receive CHIPS funding, at least one US entity must own or co-own the resulting intellectual property. I think that's both good economics, good policy, and a congressional requirement. Last but not least, we've got to invest in manufacturing. We have to ask that industry, academia, and labor work with the federal government to make US manufacturing workforce more competitive. Secretary Raimondo recently told 60 Minutes, we allowed manufacturing in this country to wither on the vine in search of cheaper labor in Asia, cheaper capital in Asia, and here we are. In response, I think we've got to collectively seek solutions that ensure that the economics of manufacturing work within the domestic context. The solutions that improve US manufacturing must be an active area of scientific research and technology implementation. The NAPMP, NOFO, and some others lay this out clearly. The United States will need a cost-effective and efficient domestic advanced packaging capability to enable semiconductors made in the United States to be packaged in the United States. It's part of our opening statement for the packaging program. When we announced the Manufacturing USA Institute, one of the key objectives, significantly reduce US development and manufacturing costs. And then we can talk about the workforce. Across CHIPS for America, the Secretary has said our goal is to double the size of the semiconductor workforce. So within the NAPMP program, for instance, we are asking proposers to establish measurable targets and milestones for education and workforce development. Not just tell us, hey, we're planning to do some education and workforce development. How many students trained? Even better, how many students hired, leveraging the federally funded resources? And more broadly, we're encouraging industry and educational institutions to broaden the participation of women and underserved groups because of what the Secretary calls pure math. Because we don't have enough workers to do the job without attracting a more diverse population. This is a challenge that must be met by the entire academic and educational community, from labor-related workforce training organizations to community colleges to R1 universities. And we're seeing that action taken. As of February, more than 50 community colleges across 19 states had announced new or expanded workforce training programs. So there's much more to come. For instance, the department announced its intent to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into workforce development activities, including establishing a workforce center of excellence that will help to convene stakeholders and use data to measure the success of programs and to expand those programs. We hope universities and semiconductor industry partners will actively participate in that center. So let's close with a recap and some next steps. Question at hand is what the government can do to help build our manufacturing ecosystem. The federal government can catalyze investment in manufacturing facilities. With $39 billion in manufacturing incentives, we have seen more than $200 billion in private sector investment. The federal government can invest in research and development and in the facilities that researchers and entrepreneurs need to lower the time and cost of commercialization. And we can set up the policies that incentivize commercialization and protect our IP. And the federal government can incentivize the creation of ecosystems and structures, like the regional semiconductor manufacturing clusters under development across the country, and the creation of membership organizations like the NSTC and the CHIPS Manufacturing USA Institute. But We need universities, researchers, and companies to join each of those, to see what value there is in shared pre-competitive research and in establishing secure domestic supply chains. Semiconductor industry is one of the largest contributors to the United States trade balance and one of the most research-intensive industries in the world and one of the most complex global supply chains, which means it takes a lot to change it. But the world of 2030, I think, can look very different than the world of 2021 or of 2024. Rather than no leading chips made in the United States, we can create a world with 20% of the chips made here. Rather than companies struggling to bring new ideas to fruition and having to go overseas with their best ideas, we can create a world where entrepreneurs move from lab to fab via access to shared domestic resources. And rather than our best ideas sitting on a shelf for our competitors to pick up, we can create a world where universities and industry protect our IP, turn it into businesses, and accelerate the competitiveness of US manufacturing. Now, I appreciate MIT's long dedication to the vision and look forward to its continued work. And I invite each of you to go to chips.gov for our resources, for our funding updates, for our vision papers, and to join our mailing list to keep apprised of the latest developments from Chips for America. Thank you.
First, Richard-Duane, I want to thank you for that extremely flattering photograph. I hope you'll send to my wife. That would be. But let me kind of ask you a kind of a next step kind of question, right? You're funding us to get through the next decade of the continuous scale down of size in semiconductor chips, and as you know well from your work at DARPA as well as elsewhere. We're running out of that scaling. So we'll have another decade of downscaling still to do, but then we're going to have to replace it with something different. So unlike batteries, we're actually going to need moonshots 10 years from now, which means in turn we've got to start thinking about what they are now to kind of build the new system if we want to keep on track with the continuing system of ever greater efficiencies in semiconductor chips. And, I think there's probably two big areas that we've got to tackle. One is, what are the next generation non-CMOS technologies we're going to need to get to in semiconductors? And another, and we've talked about this, is how do we radically reduce the design costs so that we can enable, a whole new variety of chips to kind of enter to tackle a whole new set of costs. And both of those are huge, deep, DARPA difficult R&D kind of problem. The NSTC part, the R&D part of the CHIPS Act is going to be organized around existing companies, right? How are you going to get the new vision into the NSTC to get us to the next generation of technologies where we actually need moonshots in semiconductors to happen? Can it be structured to really enable that? And then the second part of the same question is, we want the new companies and smaller companies and the startups, as well as existing companies that are going to innovate. We want them to think about how to commercialize that suite of technologies. But where's the scale-up support going to come from? Are we going to need another generation of this legislation? Thanks.
So thanks for the question. I mean, they're both very good questions. I was talking with a colleague of mine really recently about some of this question on the moonshots. And it's interesting to me that you talk about, maybe we do need some moonshots. And the secretary said reduce the cost of developing a new chip by 50%. That sounds like a moonshot to me. And you've got to get people organized around those ideas. So I think when it comes to the NSTC, what we're going to see is that those companies are going to be working with the federal government to determine what are the research areas that they're going to pursue. I said during the talk that one of the first things they said we're going to go fund is AI for RF. So we're looking at these radio frequency chips, right? So we're looking at these types of systems. And I think collectively they're going to come up with that set of questions. And I would say this, it's a little pluggish, I know. But the people at the NSTC who are going to be helping us to figure out what are those top challenges are the members of the NSTC. So we're going to need members to be joining the NSTC and pushing us in that direction. Second thing I'll say about that, though, is what my colleague said to me. And I think that we have this position where we're sort of going to have to walk and chew gum. We're going to have to be revolutionary, and we're going to have to make things manufacturable. What my colleague said is, well, I guess we've just got to make the revolutionary manufacturable. And I think I have to agree with that, right? That's sort of the challenge that's in front of us, and it's a different thing that I think many of us are used to thinking about. You talk about scale up. I think that's also going to have to be a critical part of the NSTC. There are existing companies, venture capital arms, even within these semiconductor companies, right? But how do you get to the handoff to them? NSTC will have its own venture fund. My office is thinking a lot about commercialization. One of the first things we put out was SBIR, right? Just because we know it's hard. But we're continuing to build on those things, and it's not going to stop with SBIR. It's not going to stop with the venture fund. I think we're going to keep on looking for new opportunities for small companies so that once they've done enough prototyping, they're ready to go to the next step, maybe to that Intel Capital and say, I've got a good idea here. Let's take us to the next level.
Thanks, Richard. We've actually met on Zoom before. My name's Ben Linville-Engler from the Mass Tech Collaborative, and I've spent the last 6 months as the acting director of the Northeast Microelectronics Coalition Hub, funded through the DoD side of CHIPS. And for everybody in the room, I've read all of these things. There's a lot of really great information in here. My question is, as it relates to the DoD hubs, we spent the last year plus in our region galvanizing 170 member organizations here in the Northeast region for lab to fab transition. And my question is that at the federal level, beyond the coordination of programs within Department of Commerce, how can we collaborate more, leveraging the infrastructure that we've already built? A lot of the members that we have interested in an STC, but we're starting to create a lot of multi-tiered membership types of organizations, similarly trying to do the same thing. So how can we better coordinate and collaborate? I know we're all getting things up and going, but I feel like there's, especially as it relates to workforce, technology development, scale up, there's a lot of these pieces we can string together, and just want to understand how we can do more.
So I've been thinking about this a lot because it seems like we're at a really unique time, right? $50 billion doesn't show up in the US R&D economy for one area very often. So now you've got all of these groups that are begging for your attention, right? For our attention as the federal government and for your attention. I will tell you this. We have regular calls with the Department of Defense, trying to get up to speed. What are you guys doing on the microelectronics commons? How do we talk to each other? How do we leverage each other? So we're trying to do that on our side. My suggestion to you all, because you have these coalitions come up together. And I'll tell you a funny story. Initially, when I started asking the Department of Defense, like, hey, what are you guys doing? The answer was like, well, we can't actually tell you that yet. But you know who can tell you? NEMC, the hubs can tell you, right? So I think to some extent, it is still actually helpful to keep on working through that effort, responding to NatCast, responding to us, saying, hey, these are the capabilities that we are ready to put out and bring online right now for you all. And it is going to be one of these things where, yeah, you're going to be in multiple membership organizations, and those connections, that handoff that Bill's talking about has to flow both ways. It's got to flow, DoD to DOC, but it's also through people like me, but it's also got to flow through people like you. So I think, unfortunately, the answer is do what you did with me already. Keep on picking up the phone. I will tell you, a lot of other companies doing that. The amount of times I get an email, it's like, come meet with us. It's like, I can't do that. I think you guys kind of have to do the same.
Sounds good. Thanks for all the work that you're doing too, by the way.
Absolutely.
Let's thank our speakers.